In 1956, a little over a year after the grand opening of Disneyland, the park's first expansion was announced to the public in the form of an extension of Town Square called Liberty Street. But like many unbuilt Disney theme park lands and attractions, the story of its development is a fascinating look at what could have been and its influences on the future.
3, 2, 1.
The story begins in 1955, as if you had visited Disneyland during its first year of operation and made your way to Main Street, USA. As off to the right of Town Square and next to the Maxwell Coffee House, you would have seen a large sign advertising an upcoming expansion to Disneyland called International Street, set to debut the following year. And under the sign, guests were able to, quote, take a peek at the new site, which was actually just a view of the model as no concept art or illustrations were ever created.
Now it was about 1954 that we came up with this, what you might call the climax to the dreaming stage.
In Disneyland's early days of development, International Street was initially envisioned as a much larger international land, which was to be built just north of Tomorrowland, but was eventually scaled down to just an extension of Main Street. And during Disneyland's construction, this space of backstage property was left vacant for the future site of the park's first expansion, which would have allowed visitors to shop, dine, and immerse themselves into recreations of popular European destinations.
Why don't we go shopping?
Yeah, I vote for shopping.
Planning on this new extension continued for quite some time. However, as Walt Disney began to realize that there wasn't nearly enough room for a proper recreation of Europe in the backstage property, in 1956, International Street was reworked and retitled as Liberty Street. And while initially set to open the following year in 1957, the signage for International Street would remain in place, but was finally changed around the time Liberty Street was intended to make its debut, now advertising a grand opening of 1958.
As you know, Disneyland Park is a sort of a monument to the American way of life. But after reading Johnny Tremain, we realized we had overlooked one major item in the blueprint, a memorial to the freedoms that made it all possible.
And as originally envisioned, guests would have entered Liberty Street the same way as International Street and be completely immersed into colonial America around 1775, as heavily influenced by Johnny Tremain's Boston, which Disney also adapted into a feature-length film.
Join Johnny Tremain and all the Sons of Liberty for the Boston Tea Party.
As guests walked along the cobblestone street, they would pass by a number of shops to purchase items from the time period and encounter exhibits featuring real-life craftsmen from that era. Further along the road was a recreation of Griffin's Wharf, and to the right, Liberty Street opened up into Liberty Square, which contained the Liberty Tree as well as additional shops and exhibits. But the highlight of this area would be Liberty Hall. Though it's interesting to note that since early concept art displayed the Maxwell Coffee House next to the area's entrance, the only attraction initially planned was the Hall of the Declaration of Independence. However, as evidenced by later concept art displaying Hills Brothers as the coffee shop, which replaced Maxwell in 1958, it wasn't until further in development that a second attraction was added, the Hall of the Presidents of the United States, or Hall of Presidents for short.
Say you want to see the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
The Hall of the Declaration of Independence would have been housed in a 500-seat auditorium and feature 3 scenes inspired by iconic paintings from the time of the Revolutionary War, which would have been brought to life using visual and audio effects as well as figures capable of at least some movement. The other attraction would have been the Hall of Presidents and would bring to life the story of America's history. And while George Washington would have been at the forefront, the climax of the show would reveal all then 33 presidents of the United States, who up until then had stood in silhouette.
Everything's in the planning stage, of course, but our research has taken us back to a period we'd like to recreate as a reminder that the Liberty story is a story without end.
It was an ambitious project to say the least, so much so that Walt Disney and Disneyland were awarded a special honor for the creation of Liberty Street's concept. However, as animatronics were still in their infancy, Imagineers needed more time to bring the land to life, So while work continued behind the scenes at WED on the technology for Liberty Street's two primary attractions, the land intended for the unoccupied backlot space was again pushed from a 1958 debut to 1959. And in 1960, the year marked the last time any newspaper publication would include the planned expansion, and would also be the year that the Hills Brother Coffee Garden would replace the sign and sneak peek into the upcoming land. However, even as late as 1963, the project was still in development, as one day Walt Disney was giving a tour of the WED facilities to the promoter of the New York World's Fair, and showed him one of the prototypes for the Hall of Presidents show, a very early version of a robotic of Abraham Lincoln, the first of its kind.
We're gonna make a fortune with this place.
The show promoter was floored and believed it could make a great addition to the World's Fair, and despite some hesitation on whether it could be ready in time, Walt agreed and Imagineers went full speed ahead to bring the iconic president to life in his own attraction. And it wasn't long before word began to spread and anticipation grew about this technological marvel. And when the 1964 through 65 New York World's Fair debuted, in addition to Disney's other attractions and exhibits, Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln opened at the Illinois State Pavilion and became one of the fair's most impressive and popular exhibits.
The final result is so lifelike that you might find it hard to believe. So when you visit the fair, be sure and stop by the State of Illinois Pavilion and spend a few moments with this great man.
The show became so popular that it was decided to bring it to Disneyland. But as Liberty Street was still in early development, and additional funds were tied up with the purchasing of property in Orlando for a future Florida Disney theme park, Liberty Square was put on hold in favor of giving Honest Abe a more permanent attraction of his own. And uncoincidentally, the attraction housed a model of the US Capitol made entirely out of stone, which Walt had purchased from an artist who had spent 25 years carving it, and intended to display it in one of Liberty Street's exhibits.
This here is Liberty Square. It's the heart of Disney World. And I'll tell you, it's a great place just to think and feel.
In 1971, while not originally as envisioned, Liberty Street would be realized in a smaller scale at the Magic Kingdom, and would bring to life Walt Disney's vision for the Hall of Presidents, using original transcripts and audio recordings made with Walt's supervision during the development of Liberty Street. And even up to the early 1980s, despite being removed from the park souvenir maps by 1966, concept art reveals that Disney was still trying to implement elements of Liberty Street into Disneyland, but of course this ultimately never came to fruition.
You call that progress?
Well, progress is in the eye of the beholder.
As far as International Street, this concept would also eventually be brought to life, as it became the primary source of inspiration for Epcot's World Showcase. So while Liberty and International Street as originally envisioned never became a reality, we have more than enough pieces of its original conception scattered around the parks to help us imagine what could have been. So what about you? Were you disappointed that Liberty Street never became a reality, or are you satisfied with what's come to be? Also, if you would like to help support the channel, check out my Patreon and shop in the description. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to like and share, and I'll see you next time on Yesterworld.